Chapter 9, Timberland, Part 1, Monday, May 14, 1888. Will surprised Cookie when he walked into the cookie car and dropped his bag. "Hey, mister, do you think I can hitch a ride with you to Ypsilanti?" Will asked. Cookie, who had his back to Will when he came in, swung around at the sound of his friend's voice. Very calmly he said, "Well, I don't know, sir. Are you prepared to work for your fare? Do you have any experience cooking?" "A little," Will said, laughing as he walked over and hugged his friend. "So, are you going to visit your brother Joseph in Ypsi?" Cookie asked. "Actually, I'm going there to look for a job. It was time for me to move on from farming. You know I'm still searching for my destiny, and I realized it wasn't at home," Will said. "You will always have a job here on the cookie car," Cookie said. "Yes, and thank you," Will said, "but I'm looking for something I've never done before." The two friends continued talking and updating each other about what they had been doing. Will told Cookie about little Carl's bear attack, Malcolm McKay's horse going through the ice on Lake St. Clair, and finally his sister Parthena's marriage to Henry Walls. "You sure have seen a lot of exciting things since the last time you worked with me in the cookie car," Cookie commented. "Let me tell you what has been happening on the railroad. I don't know if I told you before when you were on one of your trips to Ypsi, but about 4 years after you left the railroad, Michigan experienced 2 serious train wrecks." "No, you hadn't mentioned it," Will said. Cookie began telling Will what had happened. The first accident was in Muir, Michigan. It happened just before dawn on Friday, August 29, 1873. The westbound Detroit-Milwaukee Night Express passenger train lost a driving wheel about a mile east of town. The flagman went the required 800 yards behind the rear of the stopped train to warn the freight train that was approaching them. Unfortunately, they were on the downgrade, and even though the freight's engineer saw the flagman, he couldn't stop in time despite reversing the engines and applying the handbrakes. "Was anyone injured in the resulting crash?" Will asked with concern. "Yes. The freight train plowed into the passenger train, killing 2 mothers and 2 children who were new immigrants from Iceland. 11 other Icelanders and 3 others were injured," Cookie said. "What a tragedy," Will said. "You mentioned there were 2 accidents. When was the other?" 2 weeks later, on September 15th, and this time it involved another westbound Detroit and Milwaukee train. The train ran over a cow that had come through a break in the fence 2 miles west of Lovell, Michigan. The engine stayed on the track, but several cars were derailed, killing 2 passengers instantly and injuring 14 others. A few weeks later, 2 of the injured passengers died, Cookie said. Will thought of the fence his brother, young Jim, and Annie Sue repaired back on the farm to keep their cows out of the neighbors' fields. Little did they realize the danger a cow could pose when living near railroad tracks. Cookie interrupted Will's thoughts. "There have also been a lot of inventions by men who worked on the railroad, especially by Granville T. Woods, who was born a free black man in Columbus, Ohio, on April 23, 1856. He worked as a fireman on the Danville and Southern Railroad in Missouri. He became an engineer, teaching himself electrical and mechanical engineering. Along with his brother Laades, they formed the Woods Railway Telegraphy about 4 years ago. I think it was in 1884. He had his first patent that same year, a steam boiler furnace. The following year, Granville patented a device which was a combination of a telephone and a telegraph called a telegraphone. Mr. Woods was obviously a very intelligent man, but was he able to make a living from his inventions?" Will asked. As a matter of fact, his telegraphone was so successful, Alexander Graham Bell's American Bell Telephone Company purchased the rights, and Granville now had enough money so he was able to devote his full attention to inventing, Cookie answered. They continued talking as the cookie car rode down the track. The train finally pulled into the Dearborn station around 2:30 that afternoon. The station was busier than it normally was, so it looked like this time the layover in Dearborn was going to be longer than usual. There was so much produce and goods that had to be loaded and unloaded to ship to the Ypsilanti and Detroit markets. There were also stacks of lumber and logs from the surrounding lumbering operations that were on the platform and had to be hand-loaded onto the flat cars. Will and Cookie stood in front of the cookie car watching all the activity. "Since we have the time, Will, can you go into the train station with me and get some food supplies?" Cookie asked. "I usually pick them up when the train is returning to Detroit, but with your help I won't have to load everything by myself later." "That makes a lot of sense," Will said. We will have plenty of time because it looks like we will be here for a while." They headed to the back of the station where there was a storage room full of the railroad foodstuff. Rather than go through the station waiting room, they went down the alley between the two buildings and started carrying boxes of supplies back to the cookie car. After several trips, Will said to Cookie, "Why don't you start stacking things in the cupboards? There are only 2 more boxes and I can get them." "Thanks, Will," Cookie said. Just as Will reached the corner of the building, he heard loud voices, so he stopped and peered around to see what was going on. Halfway down the alley next to a pile of firewood, he saw 3 men. 2 were facing Will's direction and the other had his back to him. One of the men very gruffly said, "How come you fired my brother Harley and me?" The man with his back to Will answered, "Like I told you before, Sam, besides being lazy, when I caught you 2 the other night stealing the lumber you had just helped me cut during the day, well, that was the last straw. I don't ever want to see you brothers on my timberland again." The 2 men began arguing loudly with the man and then began pushing him backwards down the alley in Will's direction. The man warned them not to shove him again, and when they did, he pushed the man named Harley, causing him to trip over a piece of firewood. His brother Sam charged at the man, but he stepped aside and Sam ran headfirst into the wall of the station building, knocking himself out. While the man walked over to see if the fallen bully was okay, the other brother, Harley, quietly got up and grabbed an axe from a log on the pile of firewood. He slowly approached the man from the back as he assisted the wounded person on the ground. He raised the axe and was preparing to strike when a blood-curdling yell broke the silence. Both men turned their head in the direction of the sound just in time to see Will flying through the air. Will looked just like his Adudu White Cloud when he stopped the bear that was attacking little Carl Baker that time during their hunting trip. Will landed on Harley's back, swinging his left arm around the man's neck, and with his right hand he grabbed the wrist of the hand which was holding the axe. Harley started screaming and kicking, trying to break Will's iron grip on him. Will let go of the man from around his neck, then swung him around to face him without letting go of the hand that was holding the axe. The man looked up at the 6-foot 6-inch Will and whined, "Let go of me, boy." "You don't remember me, do you?" Will asked. "I'm the same boy you attacked in Old Sandwich Town in Canada years ago. The only difference is I'm not a boy anymore, and my advice to you is drop the axe." They looked directly at each other, and Will saw a glimmer of recognition cross Harley's face. His eyes began to get a frightened look as Will tightened his grip around the man's wrist, then slowly began lifting him up with one hand. Harley's fingers went limp, and the weapon dropped to the ground at their feet. Cookie came around the corner of the station at that moment, leading 4 police officers. While the policemen were handcuffing the 2 criminals and questioning the man that had been the victim, Will asked Cookie, "How did you know there was trouble?" "When you were taking so long, I came to see what was wrong, and that was when I saw the brothers, Harley and Sam. Remember when we met for the first time in Superintendent Ferguson's office? Well, the reason I came there was I had just fired those 2. Then you walked in and we hired you to take their place. So I knew when I saw you flying through the air, those brothers must have been causing trouble again," Cookie said. When the policemen started to leave with their 2 prisoners, one of them turned to the man who had been attacked and said, "I'm sorry for what happened, Mr. Ford. We've been looking for these 2 for a while. There are warrants for their arrest in Canada, Detroit, Ypsilanti, and here in Dearborn. They have been on a crime spree for years, but now that they're in custody, you won't have to worry about them for a while, because I'm sure they will be going to jail for a long, long time." "Thank you, officers," the man said. He then walked over to Will and Cookie. "My name is Henry Ford. Thank you for saving my life." "You're welcome, Henry," Will said, "but we met before. My name is William Perry, and this is my good friend Cookie. You were with your parents a few years ago when we gave you a tour of the cookie car." "Oh, yes, of course, now I remember. You also delivered me a Christmas present when I was young, and now you have saved my life. How can I ever repay you?" Henry asked as he shook hands with both men. "Actually, Will is looking for a job," Cookie spoke up. "If that's true, you don't have to look any more. How would you like to work with me on my timberland?" Henry asked. "That sounds great. I'm prepared to start whenever you need me," Will said. "Well, I need you now. Come on, let's go and make sure the lumber and logs I brought here today are getting put on the train," Henry said. When the 2 men began leaving, Cookie called after them, Why don't you two meet me back at the cookie car after you finish checking on your lumber? Will has to come back for his belongings anyway. In the meantime, I'll grab my last boxes of food from the storage room. Then I want to cook you men a nice meal while we wait for the train to be loaded." Later that day, Will sat in the wagon next to Henry as they headed to his farm. "I think you're going to really like my Timberland property," Henry said. "My father and mother, William and Mary, gave me this land a couple years ago. He told me he purchased the land, which included a small house from the Moore family, in the 1860s. The timing was perfect because I had just met my wife Clara at the 1885 New Year's dance in Greenfield, Michigan. The following year we were engaged on April 19th and married on April 11th of this year on Clara's 22nd birthday. The house we are living in is too small for the family, so we've been designing a new one. Maybe you can help when we start building it." "That would be no problem, because I've had experience in building. When my brother young Jim and his wife Annie Sue built their home, I helped them," Will said. "You'll have to tell me more about that and more about your family. I always like to know the history of a person, especially if I'm going to work with them." "I should have learned more about Sam and Harley before they were hired," Henry said. "But we're home now, and I want to introduce you to my beautiful new bride." When they pulled up to the gate leading to the long tree-lined driveway, Henry showed Will the new hinges he had made for the heavy gates and the device for opening and closing them without getting off the wagon. This was the first time Will saw that Henry had an aptitude for improving and inventing mechanical things. As they drove past the house on the way to the barn, he could see Henry had been right about it being small. After putting the horse and wagon in the barn, Will followed Henry into his home. When they walked into the house, Henry made a bird whistle, the sound of a robin. A moment later, the sound of a robin came out of the kitchen. Will learned later making bird whistles was the way Henry announced his arrival home, and his wife would always answer him the same way. "Callie," Henry called, "we have company." A pretty young woman came into the room carrying a bowl with something in it that she was stirring with a big wooden spoon. "Clara Jane, I would like to introduce you to my new friend, William Perry," Henry said. "Will saved my life today when I happened to run into the brothers Sam and Harley down at the train station. They weren't very happy about me firing them, and they showed their displeasure by Harley attacking me with an axe. Fortunately, Will came along and was able to take the weapon away from him in time. You should have seen how brave Will was." "How do you do, Mr. Perry? Thank you so much," Clara said as she shook Will's hand. "I don't know what I would have done if I lost my Henry." Clara turned and looked lovingly into Henry's eyes. "I told you when I first met those boys that they were no good. You could tell when you were talking to them and the way they kept shifting their eyes from side to side that they weren't trustworthy." "I know what you mean, ma'am," Will said. "I first met the brothers years ago, and they weren't very nice. They also worked on the railroad for a while with my friend Cookie, and he had to fire them for the same reasons your husband did." "Well, we won't have to worry about them any more because they will be in jail for a while paying for their crimes," Henry assured both of them. He continued, "Callie, I've just hired Will to help us on our Timberland. Do you approve?" "I can tell by looking in his eyes that he is a good man. Besides, he saved your life." "Of course I approve," Claire answered. "I'm baking a cake for dinner to celebrate Henry and I being married 5 months," she said to Will. "Henry will show you where you can sleep. I apologize, but we don't have very much room in here. By the time you men wash up, supper will be ready. It was so nice meeting you, Mr. Perry." Clara disappeared into the kitchen as Henry and Will went out back. "We have living quarters you can stay in above my workshop in the barn. You can see from our small house why building a new home for my wife is one of the first things I want to do," Henry said. When the three new friends sat down for supper, Clara began asking Will all about his family and telling him about theirs. Will learned that her name was Clara Jane Bryant, and she was the oldest of 10 children. She and Henry had met at a New Year's Eve dance at the Martindale 4-Mile house in nearby Greenfield when she was 18 years old. Henry was too shy to introduce himself, so he asked his sister Margaret, who was in the Bayview reading circle with Clara, to introduce him. Henry said he knew immediately Clara was the one for him because she was a quiet, feminine, and genteel lady. Clara smiled and said he didn't impress her the first time they met, but when they saw each other some time later at another dance, it was a different story. That was when Henry was able to interest her in a watch he had made which showed both sun time and standard time. The two of them became inseparable from that day on, and Will could tell they loved each other just by looking at them. Henry told him one of his nicknames for her was the Believer, because she was so supportive of his invention ideas and his ability. Henry, like his wife, was the oldest in his family. He had 5 brothers and sisters. Henry was born in 1863, followed by John in 1865, then Margaret in 1867, Jane in 1869, William in 1871, and Robert in 1873. They talked late into the night, getting to know each other, and the harmony among the three was the beginning of a friendship that would last a lifetime. Finally, Claire stood up, covering her mouth with her hand as she yawned. "Good night, Will. It has been fun talking with you. We don't get company very often, and certainly not someone as interesting as you. Some day I hope to meet your mother Kazar and father Henry Perry. I also want to talk to you more about the house we will be building. Maybe on Sunday I can show you the plans. I must go get some sleep now so I can cook you 2 men a nice breakfast in the morning. Don't you stay up too late, Henry. Remember, you have a busy day tomorrow." She leaned over and kissed her husband on the forehead, then went into their bedroom. "You are a lucky man, Henry. I hope some day when I'm ready to settle down I will find such a wife," Will said after Claire had left. "I can see why you call her the Believer. She certainly believes in your idea of one day inventing that horseless carriage you were telling me about. Just think of it, a machine that will transport people with its own power." "I have no doubt you will find your life partner, Will. The main thing is never settle for less than what you deserve. A married couple should have each other's best interests at heart, and if they do, they will be happy together," Henry advised his new friend. The 2 men visited with each other for about another hour before they finally went to bed for the night. The next morning, Will found out that Miss Claire was right when she said she would be cooking a nice breakfast. When he joined her and Henry, she had prepared homemade apple juice, pancakes, fried potatoes with onions, and eggs. "Today will be your first day lumbering. We will need the axe, crosscut saw, and I recently purchased a circular saw and have attached a portable steam engine to run it. The demand for lumber in the shipyards, factories, and shops in Detroit is constantly increasing. Even my neighbors are requesting my lumber, so it is hard to keep up. The steam-powered circular saw has really helped, but the only problem is the engine often breaks down, so the 2-person crosscut saw will be used a lot today," Henry said. "Thanks to you and Mrs. Ford, I'm ready for some hard work so I can work off this big breakfast," Will said, rubbing his full stomach. After the 2 men finished eating, they went out into the crisp morning. Will took a deep breath of the fresh air as Henry said, "This week we will go into the woods and fell some trees, which just means cutting them down. By next week we will be able to load them on the wagons to bring to my sawmill. There we will cut some of them up in boards for shipping by train to the Detroit market." The winter and spring months were the only times Henry operated his sawmill. In the summer he worked at the Buckeye Harvest Company to set up and service its Eclipse portable farm engines. Henry told Will about this arrangement, but let him know there would be plenty of work for him to stay on full time. "Remember yesterday when I said Claire and I are designing our new home?" Henry asked. "Yes, Miss Claire said she wants to show me the plans on Sunday," Will said. "We want to start construction right after lumbering season, so the house building will keep you busy all spring and summer. That is, if you still want to work with me by then," Henry said. "You and Miss Claire sure have been feeding me well, so I must say working with you so far has been great," Will said, smiling. After loading the wagon with equipment, Henry ran up on the porch and into the house to kiss Claire goodbye. When he returned, he was carrying a large picnic basket with their lunch and supper for the day. The Ford home was surrounded by trees, but Henry went a little further into the forest to harvest logs. He wanted to save the trees near his present house to use for the new home he and Claire planned to build. About a half-mile into the woods, they came to a dense area of mature white pine trees that Henry said would be a good place to start. Pine is considered green gold because it is the most requested type of wood since it is lightweight, has a soft texture, and can be used for house building, furniture, and many other things, Henry said. After unloading the equipment, they began marking the trees they intended to cut by tying a piece of yellow cloth around the trunk. "I want to make sure when we fell the trees the other trees won't be affected," Henry said. He continued sharing other lumbering facts with Will. "If you are going to be in the logging business, one thing you have to realize is that trees are heavy and must be handled safely. I heard about an accident where a man was injured his first day on the job. He ran to the wrong side of the tree after it had been cut, and it fell on him. Fortunately, he only suffered a broken leg." "Lumbering sounds like pretty tough work," Will said. "It can be hard, but some men have made their fortune from wood and have become lumber barons," Henry told him. "These men would hire people called timber cruisers or landlookers who search for acres of forest. The logging companies would then buy the land from the government federal land office." "Logging may be hard, but obviously has become big business," Will exclaimed. "Yes, it has, but I don't want to compete with them," Henry said. "I just want to make enough money so I can work on my inventions. Like I said before, I have a vision that one day we will be able to go across the United States with our families without taking a train or horse and buggy." Will knew that Henry's dream would come true because he could see he was a very determined man. The two men talked throughout the morning as they worked on each end of the crosscut saw. After each tree was cut down, Henry would hammer his mark, the letters HF, into the end of the logs, to show he was the owner when it was shipped to market. He also would put his initials on each board he cut from the logs in his sawmill. He shared other interesting knowledge with Will about lumbering. He told him the loggers and woodsmen were known as shanty boys because of the temporary shanties they lived in out in the woods. They used tools that had many different names like the peavey, adze, and cant hook. The jobs they did could be sawyers and knot bumpers who felled the trees and trimmed the branches. Grab drivers secured the trail of logs, and the men that sharpened the saws were called the saw filers. There were also the teamsters who drove the horses that would slide the logs to the river and give them to the men called the river hogs who delivered them to the sawmills. If there wasn't a river nearby, men called swampers built roads to haul the logs out of the forest to the sawmill or directly to the market. When Henry had shared all this information, Will asked, "Are all of these men considered lumberjacks?" "Yes, but I can't leave out one of the most important and better paid crew members, and that's the cook, who is known as a cookie, spelled Cookee," Henry answered. "That's the same name as my friend on the train. He just spelled his name a little differently. I never knew that was the name of one of the jobs in lumbering. I do know why they are paid so much, because being a lumberjack is such hard work, the men have to be fed. Just like my friend Cookie had to make sure the railroad men ate well, because they needed to be strong to handle the job," Will said. "Exactly. If you worked for the big companies, a typical breakfast menu could be flapjacks, steak, fried potatoes, eggs, hot biscuits, and sow belly, which is fat salt pork. Lunch would be much the same hearty types of food, but they had a funny name for the lumberjacks' lunch. It was called flagons. Dinner might consist of roast beef, maybe more steak, beans, potatoes, cornbread, tomatoes, and sometimes for dessert some apple pie. All of these meals would be eaten in the woods, and to call the loggers in from their work for mealtime, the cookie would blow a long tin horn known as Gabriel's horn. My lumbering operation isn't big like the lumber barons, so you will be doing the work of all the men I told you about. Callie will be our cookie, so she will make sure we are fed as well as the men that work for the big companies," Henry said. "I already know the eating on the Ford Timberland is better than the big companies could possibly offer, especially since I tasted Miss Claire's cooking last night, along with that delicious 5th-month wedding anniversary cake she baked, and that delectable breakfast this morning. All this talk about food is making me hungry," Will said. "Me too. Why don't we break for some lunch, or should I say flagons? Maybe Claire packed us some sow bellies," Henry said as the two men laughed. By the time they headed home for the day, the sun had set, so they drove their wagon back through the woods in the dark. "Working with you today was a real pleasure, Henry. Thank you for hiring me on as your helper," Will said. "Believe me when I say the pleasure is all mine. After working with you, I don't know why I put up with those two lazy brothers, Sam and Harley, as long as I did." They continued riding in silence, thinking about all the events of the last 2 days. When they got home, Will went right up to his room while Henry went in the house to greet his wife. Within an hour or so, Will could hear Henry working below in the barn, tinkering with one of his machines until the early hours of the morning. At 4 a.m., however, Henry was up and ready to go back into the woods for another day of logging. Will wondered if the man ever got any sleep. Just like the previous day, they cut some trees with the crosscut saw and some with Henry's steam-powered circular saw when they could keep it running. In the evening, they finally took a break to eat their supper. It was a beautiful night, and the quiet in the forest made it very peaceful and relaxing. "Looks like the way we are working, by the end of the week we can start hauling some of these logs to my sawmill," Henry said as Will nodded in agreement. The two men sat there enjoying their food and their surroundings, and then Will asked, "When did you become interested in machines and other mechanical things?" "My mother said I was a born mechanic because I always had a pocket full of washers, nuts, and other machinery parts. However, one of the biggest influences on me was when I was 12 and my father and I were driving our wagon to Detroit. About 8 miles from town we met a road engine. These machines were not uncommon, but this one was different because it was self-propelled. This was the first vehicle like this I had ever seen other than those that were pulled by horses. This machine was used for running threshing machines and sawmills like mine. It had a portable engine and boiler with a water tank mounted on wheels. There was a coal cart pulled behind the engine. This engine had been made by the Nichols Shepard and Company of Battle Creek, Michigan. I know all of this because the engineer was kind enough to explain the whole affair, including how the chain was disconnected from the propelling wheel and a belt put on to drive the machine," Henry said. "I can see how that engine going down the road all by itself would have affected you," Will said with interest. "It sure did, and that's when I knew I wanted to make a machine that people could use to travel different places." "You said that was one of the big influences in your life. Is there another?" Will asked. "Getting a watch," Henry immediately answered. "I love taking watches apart and putting them back together again. When I was 13, I finally managed to put together a watch that worked." "You should get into the watchmaking business. You would probably make a lot of money and not have to farm." "I know you don't really like farming," Will said. "I thought about doing that one time when I worked for a jeweler doing repairs on watches." "Why didn't you continue?" Will asked. "I figured since watches weren't a necessity, most people wouldn't buy them. Besides, I wanted to make things in quantity, and I knew making watches wouldn't fulfill my real lifelong dream, which is to make a horseless carriage for the masses," Henry said. The two men continued talking until they finished their supper. Later, they returned to their work, with each man on opposite sides of the crosscut saw. The rest of the spring of 1888 with the Fords went great. Will and Henry harvested enough logs not only to fill the order for the Detroit market, but there were plenty of logs to cut into boards at Henry's sawmill to build the house Clara wanted. "Hello, Henry." "Hello, Will," Clara said as she came up to the sawmill where they were cutting the logs. "After supper tonight, I'd like to go over the final plans for the house with you and Will before we start building," Clara said to them. "Okay, Callie," Henry replied. "Now remember, you promised, Henry. You know how you go straight to the barn to work on your machines after supper. This will only take a little time. The house will be pretty simple, but it will fulfill all of our needs," Clara said. That evening, as soon as supper was finished, Clara removed the dinner dishes and then spread out some house drawings on the kitchen table. "Now you can see this house is a simple design," she began. "It will be square with a wraparound porch and gingerbread columns and balustrades. I would like it to be a story and a half with dormers over the windows. I think that would look nice. What do you think, Henry?" "Sounds good to me," Henry answered, but looking at him closely you could see his mind was really thinking about the engine out in the barn, waiting for him to come and take apart and put back together again. "Are you ready to start building?" Clara asked Will. "Yes, Miss Clara. Tomorrow morning I should be finished cutting the rest of the logs into boards. Then I can begin working on the foundation for the house in the afternoon," Will answered. "Remember, Callie, I start work at the Buckeye Harvester Company tomorrow, but when I get home I can help with building our house," Henry said to his wife. "That's if I can keep you out of your workshop with those machines at night," Clara said, smiling. "You won't have to worry, my dear. Since I will be working with engines all day, I won't need to work on them as much at night," Henry said, smiling affectionately back at his wife. The three friends continued going over Clara's house plans for the rest of the evening, making them better and better. The next afternoon, Will began laying out the location of the foundation, and then he began digging the trench for the footing. By the time Henry returned home that evening, he was able to help pour the concrete into the trench. They had to wait a couple of days for the concrete to harden before the outside walls could be built. This was good news for Henry, because he could spend some time working on his inventions while they waited for the concrete to cure, which means to completely dry. On the third day, Will and Henry began hauling the boards from the sawmill that would be used for the outside walls. "You know, Will, my father William used to be a carpenter for the Michigan Central Railroad, so he taught me some building skills," Henry said. "Your father was a railroad man?" Will asked, surprised. "He never mentioned that when your family came to visit the cookie car when you were young." He couldn't believe that William Ford worked for the same railroad company that he had. Yes, when he arrived in Michigan from Ireland in the 1840s, he found employment with the railroad as a carpenter. He wanted to save enough money to purchase land to start farming. Eventually, he accumulated over 200 acres and has become a prominent figure in the Dearborn community. He has been road commissioner, member of the school board, and justice of the peace. My timberland is part of his property that he gave to me, hoping I would stay home and work on the farm. I was never cut out to be a farmer, but I realize farming is and always will be the foundation on which the economic growth of our nation depends," Henry said. "Your father is certainly a good example of what a person can accomplish if they work hard," Will replied. "Yes, he is," Henry agreed. Before long, the two men finally had brought over enough lumber from the sawmill to begin building. Every day more of the home was completed. The outside walls were erected and the inside partition separating the different rooms had been installed. Will climbed on top of the wall and began laying out the roof rafters as Henry and Claire handed them up to him. Like he did every day at about the same time, Henry excused himself to get a drink of water. Claire and Will both knew he wouldn't be returning because he would always end up going to his workshop to work on his engines. "Henry sure loves machines. Ever since he was a child, he wanted to invent a horseless carriage, especially when he was 14 and had his accident," Claire said. "What happened when he was 14?" Will asked with interest. "One day when he was out riding, his horse was startled and threw Henry from his saddle. Unfortunately, his foot was stuck in the stirrup, and the horse ended up dragging him all the way home. Needless to say, he was sore for a few weeks. Since that time, he hasn't been as fond of riding horses," Claire answered. "He loves the animal, but he would rather find another way to travel." "I can see how that experience could affect him," Will said. "The most positive influence on Henry and also my life was the McGuffey readers that were not only our reading instruction books, but also taught us honor, integrity, hard work, kindness, and fair play," Claire told Will. "The book emphasizes self-improvement and moral discipline, which are values that are appropriate for any generation. You and Henry have certainly practiced those values in the way you have treated me, and I appreciate that," Will said. "We feel the same, Will. Henry always talks about how much he enjoys working with you." Claire told Will more about the McGuffey readers, which were written by Professor William Holmes McGuffey in the 1830s. She said the texts for the youngest students provide basic reading skills, the older children had pictures and exercises on punctuation and enunciation, and the final volumes contained stories and poetry for the advanced students. She said Henry studied the readers when he attended the Scotch Settlement School, which is one room similar to the Elmstead Pew Settlement School that Will attended. Claire said one of Henry's favorite poems from the readers was, "The lark is up to meet the sun. The lark is up to meet the sun, the bee is on the wing. The ant its labor has begun, the woods with music ring. Shall birds and bees and ants be wise, while I my moments waste? Oh, let me with the morning rise, and to my duty haste." They continued talking as Claire handed Will the wood for the roof. About a half hour after Henry left, the quiet of the timberland was broken by an explosion coming from the barn. Claire immediately dropped the board she was carrying and ran to the barn. Will jumped off the roof and was right behind her. They reached the open barn door about the same time and found Henry sitting on the floor against the back wall. His legs were spread wide apart and he was covered with black soot from head to toe. In one hand he was holding a wrench and in the other he had a can of gas. Claire ran over to him and knelt down beside her husband. "Henry, Henry, darling, are you all right?" she asked with obvious concern. "Yes, dear," he sputtered. "I think I should have shut off the engine before adding more gas. I was trying to hurry so I could come back to help you and Will." Will went to them and he and Claire helped Henry to his feet. "One thing about this explosion, you know you have a powerful engine here," Will said when he could see that Henry wasn't injured. The three of them started laughing as Clara and Will helped Henry back to the little house in the middle of their timberland. The Fords decided that day to hire a carpenter to assist Will so Henry could spend more time working on his engines. The rest of the house building went smoothly, and in June 1889 Henry and Clara Ford moved into their new square house, which they called their honeymoon cottage. The next 2 years flew by for Will. Working with the Fords was always interesting, with the best part being the times Will would sit and watch the genius, Henry, at work on his different inventions. Whether it was taking apart and putting together an engine or repairing tiny mechanisms of a watch or clock for a neighbor, his knowledge of those complicated things always amazed Will. Even though Henry kept himself busy in his workshop, Clara and Will both began sensing he was becoming restless. For weeks he had been working on a double-cylinder engine where one cylinder would be delivering the power while the other would be exhausting. Henry knew with limited resources and material he would need to move to Detroit to further develop his horseless carriage. One day Henry was offered a job at the Edison Illuminating Company as a machinist and engineer. He couldn't believe his luck because he knew knowledge of electricity would be important in maximizing his horseless carriage's potential. Besides, he was going to be paid the unbelievable amount of $45 a month. It was during Sunday dinner when he broke the news to his wife. "Callie, you know that this year's timber has been sent to market, and since I only practice select cutting where you only cut the mature trees, we must wait a couple years before the next big harvest of logs. I'm sure you have noticed that farming has never been my first love, so I don't think I can be a farmer for the rest of my life. I have been offered a full-time job at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. If I accept, they want me to start a week from tomorrow, but I told them I must talk with my wife first." Clara took one of her husband's hands in both of hers and looked into his eyes. "I love the simple life on the farm because it's all I've ever really known. But I would follow you to the ends of the earth. Yes, I will support you in whatever you decide. I love you, Henry." The two stood and Henry gathered her into his arms. While still hugging his wife, he turned to Will. "Why don't you come with us, Will? I know people in Detroit that I met when I was 16 and worked there. I'm sure after I tell them what a good man you are, you will have no problem getting a job." "Thanks, Henry, to you and Miss Claire for always being so kind to me. But it's time for me to move on. I'm going to go home for a while before I set out on my next adventure." Without saying a word, the three friends stood in the kitchen of the new square house for what would be one of their last times. The following Monday, Henry and Claire packed up their belongings, and Will grabbed his clothes and they headed to Dearborn to take the train to Detroit. After arriving at the Brush Street train station and saying their final goodbyes, Henry reminded Will that if he was ever in Detroit and needed anything, to be sure and look him up. Will thanked his good friend and left for John Hill's ferry service to catch the boat to Windsor. That evening, Will arrived in the Elmstead Pew settlement. The family was excited and happy to see him, but Will's mother could tell by looking into her son's eyes his stay would only be temporary. He told them all about the time he spent as a lumberjack and working with Henry and Clara Ford. Will's father, a Doo-Doo Whitecloud, and brother young Jim were especially interested in this new gadget Henry Ford was working on called a horseless carriage. They listened to every detail as Will shared his stories. Later, while Will and his mother were doing dishes, she asked, "So how long are you going to be here this time, son?" "Who said I was going anywhere?" Will asked her, a little surprised that his mother could sense he wouldn't be home for long. "I'll never forget the day you were born, Will. There was nothing particularly special about that day for most people in the Elmstead Pew settlement, except it was very special for your father and me. I remember holding you that night, and you were just as squirmy as you had been when you were in my belly. I told your father that when this baby grew up, he would be a hard one to settle down. He agreed and said all he hoped for was that God would bless you with a long and happy life. So, Will, like I know all of my children and what they are like, I know when you are squirmy and can't sit still," Kazar explained to her son. "You are always so wise, Mama. You're right, I am restless. But I don't know what I really want to do next," Will admitted. "Go out to the old oak tree in our front yard and get up on your favorite branch. You will find your answers there like you always do," Kazar advised him. After they had finished the dishes, Will took his mother's advice and went into the yard and climbed up the tree. His mother stood looking out the window at her son as he sat on the limb and leaned back onto the trunk. Tears came to her eyes while she watched for a few moments, hoping he would find his answer. After about an hour, Will jumped down and ran into the house, touching the horseshoe above the door as he went. He knew what he wanted to do.